Are we human beings or are we blobs? That may sound like a ridiculous question, but bear with me. I stumbled into a salesperson today who used the term blob. That's B-L-O-B. Yes, I love to find inspiration from everyday encounters with common, but in this case, what I've come to realize is an exceptional person. I'm Roach, Mark Roach, looking deeper here to give you a perspective that enriches your life. Over the course of the 2-hour conversation with this, shall I say, man about half my age, who showed incredible insight and wisdom into American life, as well as depth in an understanding of the complexities of our fellow man, I'm moved to use this word, blob, to illustrate a viewpoint on human behavior and a dynamic that is prevalent in society today, which may be dying out. Maybe this could bring some insight to you, as I know it opened up some interesting channels in my mind. So let me share a little bit more. Blob would be a term that basically depersonalizes us all from an entity, from being human, but being the target of the advertiser or politician. Blob represents the entity being targeted or influenced or manipulated into doing what is wanted by some external influence. This is the case of media that we could expose them to holding their attention for just long enough to get the blob to act the way that we want them to act. Now, during our conversation, the term trigger came up. Finding people's hot points to trigger them out of their current reality and put them into a state that would make them welcome a product that that is being marketed to them, which causes them to spend their hard-earned money, that the blob, being an unsuspecting person who has not explored themselves well enough to defend themselves or to even know what their hot points are. The blob is asleep, waiting to be primed and excited by some movie, some show, some event they see and hear, maybe on social media or some 24/7 news channel that causes an emotional reaction in them that leads them into an action that they would not have otherwise made. The advertiser or politician, maybe even the salesperson, believes in their product well enough that they don't harbor any guilt over triggering the blob into an unconscious activity to drive them into that state. It's in their best interest, right? And then to use that trigger again and again and again to enable that person, the blob, to be moved to continue to subscribe to that product, to live out in their life, continuing to make bargains with their life that enable their continued support for the product, to conform in a community that may collectively support and agree about the economic bargain being made by this mass of blobs. And maybe the product is truly supportive for their existence. Over and over and over again, blobs trade their existence, their time, their effort and energy for currency to trade for more product from which they receive some benefit. Perhaps in an ideal world, the product and the bargain are just a fair trade. The institutions serve the blob to sustain their coexistence, an existence for the individual blob and the institution that guarantees a sense of safety and security because of their mutual interest. Now, how often is this ideal played out in life? How often is any institution able to make a guarantee for the future? Don't we find ourselves at odds over safety and security in the best of circumstances for mankind even today, after generations and generations of trials and error? So let's face it, in this relationship between institution and individual, the advertiser is something of a market maker. They may be creating or tempting the blob to believe they have needs that didn't even exist a few minutes beforehand. So maybe there's just a bit of manipulation going on, assuming that the product does actually have at least some minimal intrinsic value to help the blob sustain their existence. Or maybe just to strengthen their illusion that their life is okay, safe and secure because of this bargain. Such would be so wonderful, so ideal. Does this happen in reality? How many times do we find years later looking back at a product or a purchase or a transaction or even a government policy, and do we congratulate ourselves on our successes, or do we see the fault? Do we actually take the time to examine what's working and what is not working before we get too deep into making commitments that we can't turn back from? Do we find ourselves facing or denying the failures from the fallout from this ideal bargain? You know, I'm just pointing this out just as my new deep thinking young friend is examining in his life. This conversation continued to be rich. I mean, how many of us reach for substitutes, say drinks or drugs, or stay in relationships that feel disconnected from our truer and deeper wants and needs? Do we really support each other in the exploration and examination of our deeper and more authentic and lasting needs? How do we deal with the killer monkey that's lurking in each and every one of our shadows? How do we guarantee, or can we guarantee, our safety and security for the next few weeks of our life? Not to mention the next generation ahead. The fact is, life keeps moving on. It always has and always will, as far as I can see. There's going to be ups and there's going to be downs, highs and lows. And, you know, I continue myself to look for inspiration, for the brighter side, in spite of the lows and in spite of sometimes seeing discouragement that I see in something of a hypnosis of the masses, where the blob is being triggered or manipulated into action that may create a mindless sea of other blobs that I have to navigate and avoid. Such a dynamic seems to miss the mark. The feeling of knowing yourself deeply and honoring those feelings, you know, into the life that we live and create, to feel and be authentic. But who can blame the common Joe? It takes some time and effort and circumstances to set up the chance to live an enriched life, to live an inspired life. It's especially challenging with the collective pressure to defend the choices made by triggered blobs. When you're dealing with life through the lens of what seems like anxiety induced by these triggers, life and pressures to conform to the outcomes induced by the triggers that come to you like water from a fire hose. This is exactly where I hope to interrupt and shine some light, because it's not through some philosophy or book or movie or new epiphany where the blob becomes a human being and says no to the triggers. It's where you and I get in touch with each other, with your own feelings, with your own life, independent from the momentum in the collective, the momentum from mom and dad, from the expectations that have been handed you from the past, from generation to generation to generation, where not even the Hatfields and McCoys remember what they're fighting about. It's in the moment where you face your shadows and own your own power, where you meet your own killer monkey, if you will, where you honor your humanity and begin to formulate and connect with the innate spirit that honors our common values and interest, as no prior time in the history of mankind allowed. This is the space that's ripe where I hope we can have the chance to promote one-on-one connections with enough of you that will lay the groundwork for a sustainable platform of authenticity with each other, where we meet and acknowledge our shadows. We ease the shock of such discoveries with each other because we're all vulnerable to them. Then we can smile after acknowledging them and continue to move forward with a deepened confidence, a sense of reality in these fundamental values, with love and respect and admiration, regardless of the differences that we may have once felt separated us. But now seeing those very aspects are actually what unite us and bring us together as human beings, rather than mindless blogs triggered by the old patterns played out here on Earth. I'm Roach, Mark Roach. All the best.